Warning, this video about the histories contains stories of events that hopefully many would find disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised. Hello, and welcome to Faith, Reason, and the Things Between, a series on the great books of Western civilization. Today we are beginning Herodotus. This is my summary and analysis of Book 1. In Book 1, Herodotus goes to the roots and beginnings of the Greco-Persian Wars, several generations before they began, and uses the various stories he has collected to demonstrate his beliefs about human nature and society that we will see again and again throughout the histories. Book 1 functions as his own introduction to the work, so for this video I will point out some themes that we can notice as we go through the rest of the book. Herodotus begins to trace the history of the hostilities between Europe and Asia, according to stories gathered from the Persians and the Phoenicians that he spoke to. Oddly enough, they both agreed that there was a long series of kidnappings between the two continents over time. First, Europe would kidnap an Asian woman, then the reverse, over and over. Many of the women are recognizable characters from Greek mythology, such as Helen of Troy. Her kidnapping led to the Trojan War, which Herodotus says is the first military conflict between Europe and Asia. Paris, called Alexander, kidnapped Helen because he figured there would be no consequences for doing so, based on how the previous kidnappings had gone in generations past. Herodotus then moves on to telling us about Croesus, the king of Lydia. The Lydians were a people who, at this time, the 500s BC, were living in modern-day Turkey. They were not Greek, but had lots of contact with the Greeks, and Herodotus' readers would have all known a lot about Croesus. He was a near-legendary figure. Understand as we go that there were tons of Greeks living throughout the Mediterranean world. We see colonies of Greek-speaking people in Sicily, Turkey, Egypt, Libya, the Balkans, and much of Asia Minor, referred to throughout the histories. They were at war with each other as often as they were in alliance, but were all still considered to be Greek. They were mostly all city-states, though there are some who occasionally controlled larger territories or became part of a larger empire. This was the case for Croesus' Lydian Empire, which did include a number of Greek city-states. Croesus was fated to meet with disaster because of his ancestor Gyges, who had incurred the wrath of the gods. Gyges was once a bodyguard of his own king. The king boasted to Gyges that his wife was the most beautiful woman in the world. Gyges believed him, but the king insisted on proving it to him. He all but forced Gyges to agree to stand behind the door inside the king's bedroom, from where he could, and did, watch the queen disrobe, and then quietly slip out unseen. The queen, however, did see him, but did not react in the moment. She realized that this was the king's idea, so instead, she approached Gyges later and entrapped him. Either she will have him killed for seeing her, or he must kill the king and take his place as both king and husband. Gyges chose to live and murdered his king by hiding in the same spot as before. Herodotus then reports his own knowledge of a prophecy claiming that the gods will punish these deeds of Gyges on the 4th generation after him. This happens to be King Croesus. Why is this story here? Herodotus' great innovation is realizing that events can cause one another, sometimes generations apart. This story is a great example of that, and it gets us to start paying attention to how relatively small events can have large consequences. Croesus becomes very rich and routinely tries to expand his territory, conquering nearby Greek city-states, whose inhabitants he usually enslaves. He is visited by Solon, a great Athenian philosopher and lawmaker. Croesus shows Solon all of his wealth and power. He entertains the philosopher at his palace before asking him if he has ever known of anyone as happy as he is. To his surprise, the philosopher names many different people who he judges to be far happier than the king. They are all commoners, and all dead. Solon views the fortune of a person's life to be entirely chance, and thus no judgment can be made on one's happiness until they have died, and there is no more chance of their fortunes turning. But until he is dead, you had better refrain from calling him happy, and just call him fortunate. Croesus sends Solon away with contempt. This is the most important story in the book, as Herodotus will prove Solon's mantra to us over and over again throughout the rest of the histories. It is not so simple to decide whether someone should be considered happy or wretched, heroic or villainous without knowing the end of their story. Things began to go downhill for Croesus after that, as perhaps only Solon suspected could happen. One of Croesus' sons was killed in an accident which, despite being foretold to Croesus in a prophecy, was brought about by his attempts to undermine it. He then misinterprets another prophecy to his own downfall. The Persians had begun to grow in power, and he had wanted to know from the oracle at Delphi whether he could invade them successfully to stop them from becoming a threat to his kingdom. He was told that he has nothing to fear from them until a mule was crowned king. He is also told that he would bring an end to a great empire if he went to war. Croesus took all of this at face value and immediately set out with his army, confident in his chances of victory. The mule referred to, however, is King Cyrus of Persia, born to a Median mother and a Persian father. The great empire Croesus would destroy would be his own. An advisor of his warns Croesus that there is much more risk than reward in invading here, but Croesus ignored him. This is another theme that repeats itself throughout the histories. Overconfident leaders and rulers often choose to be blind to very useful and readily available information that indicates either that they're overstepping themselves, they're overstepping their abilities, or that there's a better way to do whatever it is they want to have done. However, they usually ignore this information because the information offered does not fit into their presuppositions and beliefs about human nature, about themselves, their kingship, their power, or how the world works. Basically, their bad ideas and resistance to better ones, the resistance to the Logos, destroys them. In this case, Croesus assumes that there's only one way to read the prophecy that he's been given, and no other information could possibly be relevant. So Croesus invades and has an evenly matched battle against Cyrus, the king of Persia, and then retreats to his home, disbanding most of his army for the winter with plans to reconvene next year with allies from around the Mediterranean to try again. He doesn't think that the Persians would actually dare to invade him, but they do. They neutralize his cavalry with camels, since horses are terrified of their smell. Cyrus manages to get the better of Croesus' foot soldiers too, and then besieges Croesus in his capital city of Sardis. Still, Croesus assumes that the siege will last for months, since he is extremely rich in gold and food, and he simply sends messages for his allies to come a little bit sooner. These messages have not even arrived at their destinations before Sardis falls. The Persians climbed up the walls after observing a Lydian soldier climb down and back up again to retrieve his dropped helmet. Croesus is nearly killed by the invaders, but his remaining son, who had been mute for his entire life, spoke in that moment, identifying his father as the king, and so the soldiers did not attack him. Croesus is instead captured and placed atop a huge pyre by Cyrus, who intended to burn him alive. As they lit the fires, Croesus' mind turned to Solon's saying that no one who is still alive is happy, and it occurred to him how divinely inspired Solon had been to say that. He broke a long silence by saying, "Solon, Solon, Solon." Cyrus is intrigued, and his Persian translators prod Croesus for the story, and then explain to their king the meaning of this name. Cyrus then changed his mind about burning him. He saw that he was burning alive a fellow human being, one who had been just as well off as he was. Also, he was afraid of retribution, and reflected on the total lack of certainty in human life. Croesus then becomes Cyrus's slave, though he is held in high regard, and he becomes one of his most trusted advisors, immediately offering helpful advice. That's the first half of Book 1. For the second, Herodotus brings the story back in time, to the origins of this war's victor, the Persian king Cyrus. The Persians were at that time ruled by another nearby people, the Medes, who began conquering Asia one tribe at a time. After several generations of kings and a brief foreign occupation by the Scythians, who will come back later, the Median king Astyages has a prophetic dream. It seems to him to be a warning that his daughter's son will depose him. To avoid this, he orders his steward, Harpagus, to take the child, who ends up being Cyrus, as soon as he is born to kill him. Harpagus does not want to be responsible for the killing in the event that Cyrus's mother takes over the kingdom, but he also needed to avoid angering the current ruler. Thus, he gave the infant Cyrus to a shepherd and told him to leave the child in the wild, threatening terrible consequences if he did not obey. The child's identity is inadvertently revealed as the shepherd was leaving. However, the shepherd's wife pitied Cyrus and suggested that instead they passed him off as their own. It just so happened that at the same time she had given birth too, but her baby had been stillborn, so they could just switch them. The shepherd agreed. 10 years later, the shepherd and his son are brought before the king on account of a scuffle with a child of a nobleman. Astyages suspects who the child is based on his look and his bearing and how he handled himself, and the subsequent investigation revealed to him what Harpagus had done to deceive him. The king was outraged, but he pretended not to be for the moment. The king's magi reconsidered the old prophecy in a new light, and presumed that the danger from Cyrus has passed. Thus, Cyrus is left alive and sent to Persia, with instructions to live in peace. After he left, Astyages killed Harpagus' son, and much worse, he baked and stewed his body to be served to him as punishment. However, at that moment, Harpagus pretended not to be bothered. "The king can do no wrong," he says. Astyages eventually forgot the whole ordeal, but Harpagus did not. Cyrus grows up to be strong and well-liked, and Harpagus offers to help him become king as revenge against Astyages. He convinced the Median nobles to accept Cyrus, while Cyrus himself convinced the Persians to rebel with the promise of great feasts, riches, and freedom from labor. The message was, in essence, "Be free and follow me." In the following conflict, Astyages is soundly defeated, having forgotten what he had done to his steward, and subsequently trusted him to mount a defense against Cyrus. From his prison cell, he rebuked Harpagus for allowing the Medes to be made slaves to the Persians for the sake of his little revenge. Notice just how much was eventually caused by the shepherd's wife through one small action. Cyrus became king and went on to defeat Croesus and the Lydians as described. He continued to conquer peoples about him if they did not make treaties or surrender immediately. Some Greek peoples on the coast of Turkey and amongst the eastern Mediterranean islands were included amongst all those subjugated. The population of each conquered city was usually reduced to slavery. To avoid this, some Greeks emigrated to found new colonies elsewhere in the Mediterranean. Others, like the Xanthians, chose to burn their city to the ground with themselves and their families in it. Cyrus also launched attacks against other peoples closer to him, such as the Assyrians. After fighting against the Jindis River that blocked his way by diverting it into numerous channels, as well as taking the Babylonians by surprise in their own city, he conquered them. He then moved north to attack the Massagetae, east of the Caspian Sea. Here, however, he met his doom. Queen Tomyris of the Massagetae had tried to convince Cyrus to go home, but to no avail. Cyrus at first won a devastating victory against her army by getting them drunk and stuffed with rich wine and food that he set out, which led to the death of her son as well. Shortly after, though, Tomyris' remaining armies killed Cyrus and defeated his army, sending the survivors fleeing back to Persia. The Persian people called Cyrus the Father, because he did all things for their good. Book 1 gives many examples of many of the ideas, mindsets, attitudes, and themes that will be found continuously throughout the rest of the histories. So I'll draw your attention to them here. Some of these items end up informing the Persian Empire's modus operandi. These are not always attitudes original to the Persians, as we see them and ideas like them among many of the peoples that Herodotus looks at, including the Greeks sometimes, but we can see them pervading the Persian Empire's mind, and especially its kings, before long. First is the power of the monarch, what that means. It was feared by some and respected by others, but either way, it was absolute, and the monarch knows it. The king asks you to kill a baby from his own family? It is my duty to serve and obey. He is to be obeyed, or you will be punished. There is no higher authority to appeal to. Not human rights, not human dignity, no court, and definitely not your own conscience. However, the gods may punish an evil king eventually. What stops Harpagus the steward from obeying his instructions to the letter ultimately is not pity for the child, or a sense of morality, although he has misgivings about it, to be sure, but rather it was fear of the king's daughter paying him retribution for killing her son. He wanted to be able to say, "I didn't really kill him. Please don't hurt me." Later, once Harpagus' own son is killed and desecrated, he summarizes the king's absolute power in a single line. Harpagus replied, "The king could do no wrong." The foil to the power of the monarch is the power of the rule of law, as an institution or an abstraction rather than a person, embodied by the Greeks in this account of Herodotus. In Book 1, Herodotus takes several paragraphs to introduce us to the Spartans and the Athenians. The Athenians had made solemn vows to follow the laws that Solon had given to them for a period of 10 years. During that time, Solon was not even in Athens, but they still honored his laws. However, the Athenians also constantly struggle against tyranny. Pisistratus becomes tyrant of Athens several times through trickery, compromises with other power-hungry Athenian citizens, and through the support of those men from the country demes who found the rule of a tyrant more pleasant than freedom. Understand that the word tyrant and tyranny for the Greeks weren't necessarily bad words. It just meant that it was, a tyranny was the reign or the power of a tyrant, a person who was the sole person in power, the sole person responsible for ruling a city or a state. However, the Athenians and many other Greek city-states began dealing with a string of terrible tyrants throughout the histories, and probably before the period that Herodotus is writing about too. So, they begin to reject tyrants and tyranny as a rule, as we'll see. Even at this time, some of the Athenians were okay with accepting the rule of a tyrant. Why? Because being free is hard. It takes more responsibility to provide for yourself rather than to have your government do that for you. In any case, the Athenians are always striving for freedom, though they do not always succeed. The Spartans, meanwhile, had, in Herodotus' words, just about the worst customs in the whole of Greece, by which he means their laws. But they changed their constitution for the better. For the Spartans and the Athenians, it is the rule of law that is valued. Constitutions are written in which the people discourse and agree what would best serve the common good, and then they follow it. Consider also in Homer the battle planning meetings amongst the various kings, soldiers, and captains. No one was afraid for his life in those meetings when speaking out against Agamemnon. Odysseus calls him a coward right to his face, and faces no repercussions. The Greeks already had a tradition of kingship that is completely antithetical to what we have and will see further east and amongst the Persian monarchs. The next theme is freedom versus slavery. Generally, the losing city-state in a war had all of its inhabitants enslaved or sold into slavery. This was true in both Persia and Greece, but it's more complicated than that. In Persia, for example, any subject is considered a slave of the king. However, freedom was symbolically granted to a people if the king was one of them. If the king was Persian, then the Persians considered themselves free, and the Medians were considered slaves. See this discussion between Astyages and his magi. Your rule is very important to us as well. If it devolves onto this boy, who is Persian, we Medes will be enslaved. But you are one of us. As long as you are king, then power is partly ours too. That's why in the final confrontation between Astyages and Harpagus, the king accuses him of condemning all the Medes to slavery by helping Cyrus. The freedom of the individual person did not matter. So long as the king's freedom was maintained as a whole, that of his own ethnic people would be preserved. But only by comparison, really. Practically, the king was the only one with true freedom. Freedom doesn't stop Astyages from executing the Magi, who are supposedly part of his people, nor does it make any of the other Medians more than slaves to him. Everyone who was not the king or of his house was considered no more than a slave of the king. Even the nobles. They were only freer by comparison. There will be many explicit examples showing this in later books, but in Book 1 we also see it in Astyages' assessment of the child Cyrus. While the boy was speaking, Astyages began to feel that he knew who he was. The boy's features seemed to resemble his own, and he spoke like a free man rather than a slave. Those are the two possibilities. Either he's free, and thus part of the king's own family, or he's not, and he's a slave, like the shepherd, his wife, and all the other regular citizens. Cyrus was doing nothing new when he led the Persians against the Medes with the battle cry of, "Be free and follow me," regardless of the irony that it would hold for us from the outside looking in. Pay attention as we go to how freedom and slavery are each thought of by any given people. It will likely be different from how we would define those terms today, and so it's all the more important to figure out exactly what is meant when those concepts are discussed. And as Herodotus will show, it varies from people to people as well. Conceptions of freedom and monarchy are both ways that the mindsets of different peoples can have real, observable effects on the actions that individuals take, or the factors from outside their cultures that may blindside them. For the purpose of this, I define mindset of a people as the beliefs, the customs, and culture that inform one's view of oneself, humanity, and their relationship to the state, to God or the gods, freedom, morality, and nature. This is partly why I think Herodotus takes as much time as he does to document the customs of each people he encounters, even if it's a lot to slog through every single time he introduces a new country. In Book 1, though, there are 3 concepts that we want to pay attention to specifically that have to do with the people's worldview. Freedom, monarchy, talked about those, and the effect of prosperity and wealth. Croesus's advisor Sandanus says, "You are getting ready to attack the kind of men who wear nothing but leather. Their food consists of what they can get, not what they might want, because of the ruggedness of their land. They drink no wine, just water, and figs are the only good things they have to eat. If you win, what will you gain from them? But if you're defeated, think of all the good things you will lose. Once they have experienced the benefits of our way of life, they will cling to them, and it will be impossible to dislodge them." He's not necessarily insulting them here. He's warning Croesus that it's a bad idea to attack them. Croesus echoes this line of thought once he's beaten. He actually helps Cyrus to make his power more absolute, because once he is captured, he immediately warns Cyrus not to let his men loot the city, for whichever one of them receives the most will try to depose him. And that is because, he says, the Persians are not used to having riches. This changes once the Persians start winning, and in fact we will see a total reversal of this situation by the end of the Histories, along with a short flashback from Cyrus where he reflects that it is better to live in a harsh land and rule rather than to cultivate fertile plains and be others' slaves. Next theme, the mantra of Solon to Croesus, to call no one happy until he is dead. There are countless actors in the Histories that will begin well off, only to die miserably, or miserable. Those who become heroes, only to devolve into vice by the end of their lives, and vice versa. No pun intended. There are some figures who meet with misfortune, whose luck begins to turn later. Croesus is, of course, the poster child for this idea. The story of Croesus is also a good example of the 5th theme, which is selective blindness. This, in a word, is the tendency of powerful men to ignore the limitations the world has placed on their power, and in particular to fail to hear information that would be useful, but does not fit their own notions of the scope of personal control over events. Croesus's conception of his own power is shaped by his immense wealth. He makes tremendous offerings to the oracle at Delphi, trying to get a favorable omen for his invasion, and is warned by the oracles that fighting the Persians would bring an end to a great empire. Because he's paid so much, and ideally the god is bought, and on his side, he assumes that there's only one good interpretation of this, that surely there's no other way to take it. And furthermore, he assumes that he can buy his way out of whatever troubles come. He still thinks that when he's besieged in his city because he has plenty of food and plenty of allies who are on the way. Remember also, what he thought would impress Solon was his wealth. Depending on who we are speaking about, instances of this theme will either be treated as the power of the monarch or of selective blindness, but both have to do with the ideas adopted by a king or a ruler about his relationship to the world. There are also some tangential themes and developments that are important to notice, but they won't come up as much. These include the treatment of women and children, the respect for human dignity, or lack thereof, the understanding of the gods, and increasingly as we go, Herodotus' support for Greek unity. There are already a ton of examples of these themes in Book 1, and I won't go through them all. But you've certainly already noticed that this does not resemble the modern world. There are plenty of soldiers, kings, and even common people throughout the Histories that hardly hesitate to kill women and children, other innocents, kidnap them, relocate them, or mutilate bodies, as we saw with Astyages and Harpagus' son. You will find few saints by our standards today, so I ask you instead to consider which people's customs or habits are trending in the right direction. Under what circumstances or peoples are children and women and human dignity most respected, and why? So as a quick review, count no one happy until he is dead to account for the changing nature of life. The Persians and Greeks had very different ideas about freedom, slavery, monarchy, and government, and these have had direct consequences for how the common person is thought of and treated. with more examples of this as we go on. Powerful men have a tendency to ignore useful information or competing ideas that don't fit their worldview or their view of themselves, and this leads them to disaster. This can happen on a large scale and a small scale. And historical events have complex causes that can reach back decades or even centuries. Herodotus gathers all the data from multiple competing sources before piecing together the narrative. And yet, many of these causes are driven by the choices of individuals, even small ones without wealth or power. Join me next week to continue the story in Book 2.